Ryan Ray and Ben Samuels present Bring in the Closers, a podcast on making deals and doing business.
Okay, welcome into the second episode of Bring in the Closers. Ryan Ray alongside the Master Jedi himself, Ben Samuels. Ben, how's it going today, sir?
Absolutely fantastic. Had a great weekend. What about yourself?
You know, it was really good, and the only thing that was disappointing was I didn't get any listener feedback on the first episode, but I'm assuming that's because we didn't release the first episode, and I like to blame Nate, but I can't blame Nate this time, and I don't like to blame myself, but it's not even my fault, so that leaves one person on the show. We'll leave that person nameless for now, but hopefully the first episode will be out by the end of the month. That's our goal, if not sooner. And the second episode will follow shortly thereafter.
See, I took it upon myself, week one, you set a really lofty expectation. So I figured right off the bat, if I just came in under the bar, that we could start off on the right foot. And then from there, we can build up. And so, week one, I decided to hold back a little bit, wanted to delay the goods a little bit. So we, now we have two podcasts to unveil, in short order, and we can get people rolling, but I didn't want to come out of the gates hot.
Well, that's why you're a Jedi Master, because what you're teaching them is sometimes when you're closing a deal, you have to let it marinate a little bit, let it sit, let it simmer before there's a real appetite for the deal at hand. Okay, we got an interesting topic to get into today, and it's around the issue. Something we talked about offline is about this idea of multitasking or having a lot of things to do. And we don't want this show to be a show where we're giving ourselves attaboys and look at what we do and all this stuff. But I do kind of want to walk through a little bit about just kind of our schedules at maybe a high view, high level, and just kind of how we handle those things, and just kind of explore, when do we decide to dive in? When do we decide to delegate? When do we decide to take on more responsibility? And so just kind of at a very high level, Ben, why don't you kind of walk us through, we talked last week, some of the things that you have going on, but, what does your typical week look like, and how do you go about deciding when to dive in, when to press the pause button, or when to pass on something?
Those are some great questions. I'll be honest, I could talk at length about any number of those different things. So I'm going to kind of start somewhere, and then we can kind of, jump off from there. But I think what it comes down to, and I think at the highest level, what I'm always focused on are what are the tasks and what are the things on my plate and what are the things that I'm looking at that are going to move the needle the most, where I can be the most effective and I can have the most impact. And then most everything else, who can I delegate that to? How can I delegate that? How can I get those tasks and those other things done so that I'm maintaining, again, like we talked about last week, and like the listeners will hear once we get that podcast uploaded, it's about finding what you're good at, staying in your lane, and then finding the rest of the picture to come together. And so I think number one is, know your why. So, and I know a lot of people say that, and I've heard that on a lot of different podcasts. And so I have kind of a different view of that, or this view that kind of cobbles a lot of that together. But really what it comes down to is, why are you in the business that you're in? Why are you doing the deals that you're in? Why are you in the job that you're in? Whatever your situation is, let's say, there's probably some listeners that are in college. Why are you in the major that you're in? Why are you doing what you're doing? What is the goal? And I think it's really important to always have two things in focus at the same time. What are the short-term goals? What's the long-term goal? And are the short-term goals that you have in place going to actually realistically get you to that long-term goal? Because I think a lot of times what I find when talking to others, and something that I constantly have to navigate around, is making sure that in the short term, I'm being effective and I'm doing the things that need to be done for the short term, but also that I'm moving the needle to where I want to go long term. And I think a lot of times you kind of get bogged down in the weeds and you lose sight of one or the other. And I think it's really important at all times to maintain that balance and keep those things in mind.
Okay, so I would describe it like this for me, and I'm curious if this makes sense to you. I envision what I do is if you were to draw a big circle on a board, okay? And everything that I do needs to fit into that circle. And so at least in my mind. That doesn't work for anybody else practically, but in my mind. So if I am doing this podcast with you, I have to be able to evaluate it and say, okay, I'm doing this podcast with Ben because I believe that this is going to benefit me in these 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever ways. That could be short term, be long term, it could be both. And as I evaluate what I take on and what I do, I kind of look at it through those lens. And so I'll kind of give you just kind of how quirky I think on some level is, but on some level, I talked last week about managing fighters. Well, one of the things that I think about managing fighters is that I'm always trying to figure out ways to increase my revenue just like everyone else is. Okay, well, that's an industry that's not tied to my main oil and gas stuff that I do. Okay, so there's that. There's also this reality, Ben, that for me is that there's spheres of influence that we all have, and celebrities have different spheres that we have. They get different opportunities, different people come to them. And if I can crack into some of that, if I get some big enough fighters and kind of work in that game, I can be exposed to people that I would never come across that then might come back and help me invest in an oil and gas opportunity or a real estate deal or whatever the case might be. And so that's kind of how I try to evaluate things. And as long as I'm doing something and it kind of works in that sphere and it's not too burdensome on me, with that circle rather, and it's not too burdensome on me, I try to balance that, which means I take on some things that I'll try for a while, and then I figure out, okay, these connections, I thought they were going to link up like this. It's not really going that way, so I'll scrap that. And there's other things that I do that blossom, and they become even more fruitful than I would have thought from the beginning. So that's kind of how I view things, which means I have a lot of weird little things that are kind of going on. But in my mind, I'm trying to connect them, saying, okay, is this working out how I thought it was? And then if you were to bring me something new that's not at face value what I would think it is. And I think I used the analogy last week or offline about, selling lobsters to someone. Well, if I were to someone to offer me, hey, will you go and sell these lobsters or broker a deal for this lobster trade? I would have to first thing is, does this fit into the circle of how I'm doing things and all the things I'm trying to accomplish? And off the top of my head, it doesn't. So then I decide, can I fit it in there? Is there a reason to expand my circle? And I had to look at it like that. So I try to view things as I'm trying to bring as many people, as many contacts, as many things into this circle that I'm dealing with, because ultimately, I think that helps me, do some of the things that I want to do in the long run. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons that you and I work so well, because on that level, we speak the same language. So let's take this lobster deal quickly and look at this. And I'll give you kind of a brief overview of how I would step into that arena, or what I'd be looking at, because that is completely outside the box, right? That's totally outside the fairway. Nothing I've done before, don't have any context in those markets. That would be starting from the ground up, right? And so I think that's, in a lot of sense, that's a great way, or that's a great deal for you and I to talk about as kind of a launch pad for this podcast on this episode, to kind of give you an idea. And so first thing that, someone came to me and said, okay, so I have 10,000 pounds of Maine lobster that's ready to be delivered. I need a buyer within 72 hours. They need to have this, and this qualification, and we're looking for this, and this. Do you have something? And so I would immediately say, I don't off the top of my head, I don't have those contacts, but let me make some calls. Let me see what I can find out. And so my job from there would be, okay, so who do I know that has boots on the ground in the Northeast? Who do I know that maybe owns a seafood restaurant? I used to go to I went to Northeastern in Boston for undergrad, huge seafood area. So I may call some people in the Boston area. So I would make some calls in my network to figure out, okay, do I have any direct ties in? And then at that point, the person that I'm calling, if they have an actionable lead of something that I can take care of, it's, depends on the relationship. So if they have a good enough relationship where it's just a phone call for them, say, hey, I've got someone looking for some lobster, and they want to put the deal together, we would probably be discussing an equity split on the fee, or however we might be able to put the deal together. And that way, because they're bringing a lot more of the value. Whereas, let's say that, somebody that I call knows somebody that knows somebody that knows somebody, and I've got to make a number of calls to get to the right person. Each person in that chain is going to get taken care of, and they'd each get a little finder's fee, but I'm doing a lot more of the legwork. And so the deal would come together a little bit more differently, because the end goal, and what we talked about on the first podcast, throughout this entire process, my goal is to make it the easiest, cleanest deal from my perspective as possible. And so that means that I'm getting direct to the buyer, and I have a direct to the seller. And so that at that point, I step out of the way put those two parties together and they get the deal done. And so, I mean, that's like one version, and we could take a whole podcast to talk about other avenues to take. But that would be what I'd be looking at. Just off the top of my head, we just talked about this today. That's what I'd be looking at. And I mean, the end of that is, okay, so let's say that I make those phone calls and I'm not able to find anything in short order. In 20, 30 minutes of phone calls, I know that it's not going to be easy for me to put it together. And so I can make a phone call and say, listen, it doesn't look like I have this. If I get some traction on it, I'll let you know, but it's not going to be something I'm going to be able to act on so that I can quickly get it off my plate. Whereas there's other deals like some couple of deals that you and I are working on that it's not immediately apparent whether, there's a deal or not, but it's attractive enough of a deal and there's enough traction to kind of go down that road a little bit farther. And I think one of the keys is, and we can talk about this as well, is like, when do you pull the ripcord? When do you stop that process? Because like some of the things that we've talked about, there's a point where it makes sense, and then there's a point that it doesn't make sense anymore. And so I think it's really important to keep that in mind as well, when you're evaluating these things.
Yeah. So one thing you didn't say at the beginning, you touched on, and maybe I would think about it a little bit differently just to use an lobster deal. I know one person who is somewhat tied in that space, and I don't know his level, so I would call him up, kind of like you're saying. And so I would have one or two conversations from the beginning, which would be to the lobster man, hey, what's in it for me? Or B, it would be with the first person I'd call, and I have a few other folks that are kind of deal people that I'd call you or some other folks. But one of the things that sticks out for the lobster deal, particularly for me, is if the lobster person called me out, it would have to be very apparent what's my cut on this, because I don't know long term anything about the lobster business, and I'm probably not going to find it out enough to, even if we did this deal. So if it was an oil and gas deal, however, if you called me up and said, hey, or someone called me up and said, hey, I need so-and-so. I just need a name of a person over here. I might just pass that along for free, because there is a way that I can leverage that long term. So just the fact that it's outside my normal sphere is going to make me look at it more critically, where something inside my sphere, depending on what's in my sphere, my circle, if you will, I don't want to give away free deals all the time, but I might sometimes look at something and say, you know what, this is something I can just put these two people together. There's probably not a lot of money to be made. I can connect person A with person B, and then later on I can leverage that, hopefully for if I need something, I'm trying to close a deal later on, I can leverage that. So being outside the sphere, I almost start off with a different standpoint of how I'm going to tackle this process.
Absolutely. Completely agree. And even more so than that, to say it another way, if it's a deal inside the sphere, so if it's an oil and gas deal, you know how those deals are generally operating. You know how, the general fee, how they're generally put together. Whereas a lobster deal, I don't know if if the normal is a 10% cut. I don't know if the normal is, $100 flat fee. I don't know if it's $100 per pound. Like, you have no idea how it's put together. And so you're also starting, if you were to get traction on a deal, when you get to the negotiation table, you also need to have some guidance on that, or you're, like you said, I mean, you need to have a much better sense of what the upside is when it's a deal that's outside the scope.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of things to think about when you look at stuff like that. You sit back and you try to evaluate it, and just to kind of beat the dead horse, if you will. It's also the long term. Even if it was a $3,000-$4,000, getting to $10,000, you might say, okay, it's worth it. But is that $10,000 going to take away from 2 or 3 months of my time where there's a lot more oil and gas stuff or stuff closer to what I'm used to that could be building upon that I'm going to lose out on?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it could be as easy as, if you were to call me and say, hey, I've got this guy looking for some lobster, but, if we can get some lobster, a deal done with him, he also owns, $100 million worth of oil and gas assets. I mean, then I can work all day. I'll work all day. It
That's right.
So, I mean, if there's a tangible upside, even if it's not with that deal specifically, if it's just a relationship builder, I'll do, there's a lot of times where I'll work and not take a fee if the back end, if the back end makes sense, if there's an upside.
Yeah, and so it's interesting because one thing you said, I think that kind of gets mixed up here, and we're talking about how to decide whether or not you want to proceed with a deal or if you want to pursue something. Is a lot of times once you kind of establish a network, you can actually source out whether something at least has potential within the I would say a day. And I say a day because you might send a text message that took you 3 seconds, but it takes 8 hours to get a reply. But you can make a few phone calls, send an email to a text message, whatever the case is. You can kind of do the bulk of the front end of the work pretty quickly. And then to kind of cast your lines out there just to see if there's some nibbles, and then kind of sit to see what comes back, and you can kind of move on to something. It's then once there is a nibble, then you have to decide, is it worth pursuing or not.
So you hit on something really important, and I think it's really key because I'm not sure that we really talked about it on the first episode. I think you and I have both been talking about concepts that are almost, step 3, 4, 5 in the process. And what I mean by that is step 1, in order to get to where you and I are talking about, you need to build the network. You need to spend the time finding the right connections so that if you have a deal or if you have a question, you know who to call and you know the right people to be talking to that have the right information, because there's no way to do, a lot of these deals, and there's no way to be the industry expert or the person that someone comes to you to put a deal together unless a couple of things. Number one, you have the right connections, or you are the right person. And so if you're not, if you and I are not going to be running companies that own the assets that we're selling and not running a picture like that, you need to have network and be able to put the right people in the right place. And it's because it's not just as simple as you're hearing about a deal and then making some calls and putting it together, right? I mean, you need to know who to call and what to do when the deal comes across your desk. And I think that's kind of we can kind of gloss over that, but I think that's a really important first step.
Yeah, and just to kind of piggyback on some of the networking stuff, let's talk about that, because one of the things that, I'm sure listeners and people in general is how do you build that network out? And we talked briefly last episode about kind of this idea of a side hustle, if you will. And I think one of the things that I realized over time is that if you start with the idea of hey, I'm not going to make any money. Let's just kind of put that there. I'm not going to make any money, but I am going to start passing along information. I am going to start sharing opportunities. What you will find is that there are people out there that have those connections to the people that you're wanting to get to, or they themselves can help facilitate it. Now, if you start with the kind of preconceived notion of I'm not going to make any money, what happens is the way you present something changes, because you're like, hey man, look, listen, just so you know, Bob over here needs this and Si needs this, and I don't know what to do with it. I'm just passing it off to you. Now you genuinely might not make any money, but the odds are, if the person has any integrity, any wits about them, they're going to say, you know what, I'm going to actually give this guy a referral fee or what the case is. But that seems to be the easiest way to build it, and you build it based upon this idea of you're trying to learn the business without having to demand a fee or this, that, and the other. And you probably will get paid on most of those type things anyways, until you can kind of get your feet wet and expand your network. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you hit it right on the head. We talked at length about that, but I think absolutely. I think you have to be intentional with how you put it together, and I think it's a process. But no, I agree.
But you think that's the way to build out your network? Because that's what you said. You kind of skipped 3 and 4. Do you think that's how the best way? Someone's listening and said, you know what, I want to get the deal making business, or I want to start making more deals. I don't have the network. I guess what I'm proposing is test your network by bringing opportunities or what the case may be to your network. It's hard for someone who might be a salesperson or a CEO or a project manager to start overnight saying, I'm putting deals together, because they say, well, what's your track record? Well, none. Well, here you're kind of reverse engineering it by bringing opportunities to people. And it might be something small as, this person needs a sales lead. Here, I gave it to them. That is a deal. Person needs a sales lead, and you give them the opportunity. So how would you suggest for someone that wants to, because that's what you said, we kind of skipped to step 3 or 4. What is that key step to building out your network that way?
Gotcha. Yeah, I misunderstood the question on the front end. No, I think, it's what you're comfortable with, right? I don't think there's one answer for that. I think what comes to mind when you talk about that, when you were asking me the question, is find the way that you're going to bring the most value to whoever the partner is. And so, there are some firms that have very specific, they're looking for this type of asset in this area, and they have very specific, and so if you happen to know someone at one of those firms, try to figure out what those parameters are. Then, try to, and we could talk at length about, deal generation and lead generation models. Mm. But I mean, the goal would be then to go find someone in your network, or someone that you're, interfaced with in some other way, that has access to that sort of deal. Or, if someone calls you and says, hey Ryan, I've got 600 acres of minerals to sell in Glasscock County, but I don't know what I'm doing with it. And you don't have any of the network or any of the contacts. The first thing that I would do is I would pick up the phone and or like look through like an APL directory and call someone that look like after I'm looking at their website, they're buying minerals in that area, and kind of like organically work the process. Because I think one of the important parts of this process, and one of the things that we could talk about again at length, is I may define a good partner or someone that I want to bring deals to and work with differently than you and differently than someone else. And so I can't tell you what a good partner is and like what you're looking for in someone to bring deals to. And so it's going to be trial and error. I mean, there's a lot of lessons learned in putting deals in front of groups that, there's a lot of groups that act in certain ways and do business in certain ways that won't jive with everybody and how they do business. I mean, you just kind of have to work through the process, right? And so I think it's really granular, but I think part of that process is finding your niche, finding the value that you can bring, and then also within the people that how can you do them the best service, and who do you want to work with? I know that was kind of a long-winded answer, but those are kind of some of the things I'd be thinking about.
Yeah, and we'll get back to the multitasking thing. The only thing I would say is that one thing that it's hard for us to remember is this people in general is that most people aren't interested in things that we're in. So if you're around a bunch of engineers that are serious, like design type engineers, they're really into engineering. They're probably not going to be into deals and putting together stuff. Some of them are. I'm not disparaging engineers, I'm just picking a title here, but they're probably more oriented around projects and building stuff or whatever the case may be. If you're in sales, then you're around a lot of salespeople, which means that you feel like everyone's probably more inclined to do deals or to put stuff together because that's what you're around. But actually, there's a lot of people out there who have no interest, but they have or don't have as much interest as you do. So building up your network where you can find leads or refer leads is probably a little bit easier. But if you're in the sales type position, it probably feels like everyone's wanting to do it. The reality is, I don't think most people actually want to kind of go down this bunny hole that we go down.
Absolutely. No, this is a very specific, and I think one of the reasons that I picked this niche above or some, among others, is the fact that there's not very much competition in this specific niche. And what I mean by that is that one of the things that I have found time and time again, and there's a lot of value to this, I'm not talking down on it at all, but there are so many people, and I would say the vast majority of people, they want to stay in their lane. So once you figure out what the lane is, they want to stay in that lane. And so, if their company is only producing minerals in the Delaware Basin, generally they're going to stay, doing that. And there's not a lot of people that have the appetite to be, flexible and malleable enough to do kind of all these different things. And so I think to a certain extent, I think there's value in being the industry expert. And so if you could, position yourself that anybody in the Delaware Basin, if they're looking for SWD development for, under, these 6 operators, like you're the person that they call, that those kind of things are invaluable to the market for both sides and for the person doing it. So that, what I mean by that is if you're the person that can position yourself in that niche that I just painted, the operators are going to learn to love you because you can develop deals directly with them. The landowners are going to love you because you're the one that can walk the deal into the right person at the right groups and get them top dollar. And then you're going to do really well because you're the one putting all the deals together. And so those are like the win-win-wins that I'm talking about. But it takes a lot of time and care to be that person, right?
Okay, let's circle back around to where we kind of started before we went off this tangent, but it was kind of necessary, I think. Let's talk back to where we were, which was multitasking, delegation, how to figure out what tasks to do. One of the things, Ben, when you're talking about, work-life balance, or you're talking about time management, or you're talking about, how to do certain things, it's really hard for me to describe how I think about things because I found more so by other people's actions than my own is that I just think about stuff a little bit differently than they do it. And I'll give you an example. If I am sitting around and I don't have anything to do, and I've got 4 or 5 things that I'm working on that they're just stuck. They're just stuck for whatever reason. I can't get this thing down the line. I pick my phone up and I go through all my old text messages. If I have a text message on the phone, I scroll through it. I don't care if it's 2 years old. If I text you, I'm looking to see what we talked about. to kind of generate, okay, maybe there was something with this person that I've omitted. I might get on LinkedIn. There's kind of becomes this tenacity to where when I might have 15 things, but if I have something that kind of gets stuck and I got to figure out how to do it, I don't know how to explain it other than I kind of go, I need to exhaust all options. And it seems sometimes that gets lost, is that there's probably a lot of options out there for people. When you're talking about multitasking, though, you can kind of get caught off guard, but we have to be able to balance multitasking and then lasering in to do something and then getting back out of that thing and going on to something else. So how do you handle that? You've got 15 things going on. Some of them you're more involved than others, but something kind of gets, jammed up or it's not progressing. How do you get it off of center, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, and I will freely admit that I am not the best at this. It's something that I'm actively working on getting better at. But going back to this theme, you and I have talked about, once the podcast that we recorded, the other podcast for the other series launches, we'll get into this. But I think setting the expectation up front about telling people that I'm involved with, listen, I'm working on a number of different things, and so I may drop the ball on this or that. Feel free, if there's something that's on my plate that I need to do and you need an answer from me, send me an extra text or call me an extra time. That's okay. But with that, if I get, and I tell people, if I get to the point where it doesn't look like this is going to make sense, I'm going to need to move on to something else. And just having that be the expectation on the front end avoids it being an issue on the back end. And so I think it's, I do that. I tell people that. And so that's a part of the balancing act for me is maintaining that focus. I want to be people, someone that people can bring, deals to and bring assets to. And depending on what level of involvement they're looking for me to have, I mean, if it's just, I'm just giving them counsel or just, they've got some questions and I'm answering questions, my phone is always open for that. I don't need time, I don't need extra time for that. But if there's something, if there's a deal that I'm going to have an immense amount of involvement in, it needs to make sense. It needs to align. And I need to have the freedom to engage with people that will be okay with me, drawing that line when it makes sense for me.
So let's dive in that a little bit more, because that's kind of interesting to me. We'll use I know this is a kind of a baseball themed title, but we'll use a kind of a basketball analogy here. What is your typical, when someone calls you about something, are you wanting to be more of the point guard who's kind of get the ball, facilitating it, and then maybe the ball comes back to you and you got to shoot it, maybe it doesn't? Or are you wanting to be that kind of that traditional low post player who we're dumping it down and we're feeding, and you're wanting to put up, 30 points and 10 rebounds? You want to be the kind of late game 3-point artist who comes in and hits a big shot. Where do you kind of see yourself if someone brings something to you before they even bring it to you? Where do you think, what optimally I would like to fit in here and why?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, and I'm going to avoid on this podcast, at all times trying to be like a broken record. But I think it goes back to this concept of, so one of the things that I love more than anything, and I truly mean this, is when someone calls me and says, hey, I'm looking at X, Y, or Z, or I'm thinking about business proposition, A, B, C. Here's what I'm thinking about. Here's the issue that I have. What do you think about that? I love those conversations. That's what really gets me going. So what I'm, so taking that picture, that's what I love. And so when I do that on the deal side, that's really, gets me motivated. And so, I will say, I will admit that I like to have control over the deals that I'm working on. And so that means a lot of times that I like to be able to call the shots. And that's not to say that I don't play ball, but that just means that if someone is bringing me in and bringing a deal to me, what that tells me is that they're looking for me to provide value. And the way that I can provide value is by orchestrating the deal the way that it makes the most sense. Now, that being said, if it's explicit or, if it's understood that I'm just on the advisory role, or if somebody calls me, a lot of times someone will call me and say, I was just talking to somebody a couple of weeks ago, and they said, hey, I'm looking at this working interest under operator X in the Permian. Do you have a contact at that operator? And we talked about how the deal would come together. I figured out how, what my side would be. And then I just made the connection. I would put a phone call together and then I let them run with it because that's how they wanted to get it done. So, there are times I'm absolutely happy to step out of the way. And so it really kind of depends. Again, like we talked about earlier in the podcast, it depends on at what level I'm involved and what I'm being asked to do. But in answer to your question, there's a lot of times where I just have conversations with people that have, like, I was talking to somebody yesterday about a nonprofit idea that they have, and that, there's no upside for me. There's no fee basis, but we were talking about, through a lot of the problems that they're looking at, and I love having those conversations. And so it kind of depends. It's a time management thing more than anything, right? That's what all this comes down to. It comes down to time value of money. It comes down to, I think that if someone were to ask you or I, what is your time worth? Not what do you charge someone per hour, but what is your time worth? That number would probably scare a lot of people. And I think that's the point where that we value our time such that we know what value we can bring. And so, and if it falls under that price point, I won't speak for you, but if it falls under that price point, more than likely I'm going to delegate everything else because it's not worth my time. It doesn't move the needle enough. And I think that's all kind of wrapped into the whole picture.
Yeah, it's interesting because I would say for me personally, is I really want to find someone who has something, and then me make the 10, 15 phone calls, whatever, find the person who's far better, far more technically experienced, or whatever the case would be, and let them walk through it, allowing myself enough see the table that when there is a problem, I say, yeah, when there is a problem, I can come back in and help solve the problem and move things along. It feels like that works out better for me because I want to be doing 1,000 different things. That's when I'm the happiest. When I got about 1,000 different things going on, and I can kind of pop in, I can go on, I can do this, I can go on. That's what keeps my interest level. And so I really like having enough seat at the table where I can come back in. There's no kind of log jam, and I can say, okay, hey, this is my 2 cents on what we should do. That's kind of how I try to run the businesses that I'm involved with, is let the people that do it, and there's a problem, let me come in and try to solve it. But I learned a long time ago, Ben, that I'm not a real technical person. That's just not my deal. I don't want to sit here and learn how to, we got Nate as a podcast. I used to have my own podcast, and I learned just the very minimum to be able to produce it because I'm not a technical person. I lose interest after a short period of time on learning technical things or things that don't interest me. So I kind of see it as, if there's opportunities, let me see if I can put the people together who are far more experienced or have more interest in maybe doing this, that, or the other. And then I can come back in at the same time. If there's 3 people involved in a deal, I can go and say, you know what, let me work on this other thing, and maybe it ties into this, maybe it doesn't. But I like to just I always kind of joke around 5 wide, football analogy, full court press, basketball analogy. I like to be like that, just kind of wide open. Just there's just things coming, and I want to be able to facilitate that.
Yeah,
which is a little bit different than which is a little bit different.
I think we're talking about it from 2 different angles, because I think I was talking about it more at the micro level and not the macro level. But at the macro level, I agree with you as well. I think it's about being able to be the point. At a macro level, I think it is about being able to be the point guard and call the shots and kind of direct the flow and figure out kind of who's going to do what's going to happen and where things going to go. I think that's really important. I was talking about more on the micro level of, like, once you're in a deal. But no, I think at a project flow level, I completely agree with what what you were talking about. I don't know if Nate caught that, by the way, but what I understood is that Nate should be charging you more.
We'll cut that out before we send it to Nate. That's what we'll do. Oh, poor Nate. He's in his little dungeon typing away right now. So we talked last week briefly about this kind of idea of the phone is always on. And it was kind of funny because, like, 2 days later, I was off going fishing and I was texting you about something. I don't remember what it was now, but now that fishing spot doesn't have service, so that's kind of the phone's not on there. But generally speaking, we talk about again, kind of go back to where we're multitasking, delegation, but the accessibility, and it's not just the accessibility; it's the accessibility and the ability to kind of pull up where you were when this particular item you were discussing was last discussed. So it's not just that Ben can answer the phone. Ben has to answer the phone or respond to text in a timely manner and keep up with, hey, this is what we're talking about. How do you balance that? Like, how do you, are you a note taker, or are you someone who, I know we have a little project board that we kind of share for some of the stuff we're working on. I use that stuff a little bit. I mean, how do you, in your mind, keep track of everything that you have going on?
It's a constant battle. I'm constantly looking at different tools that are online. There's so much stuff that's coming available with like artificial intelligence and all these calendars and all these different integration tools. And so I make it a project to consistently be kind of testing out whatever's coming out or kind of trying to keep up with those things. But I mean, in short, I will tell you, I would be absolutely lost without my calendar. My calendar is my guide. There was like a running joke. I don't know if you I don't know if you plug into Google Calendar nearly as much as I do, but a couple weeks back, the Google Calendar went down for about 10 hours. And like there were like memes going around about how people were just like wandering around lost because no one knew where to go.
Right.
And I'm like kind of that way. I mean, I have a very good idea on a day-to-day basis. Like when I wake up in the morning, I know exactly what I've got on the schedule that day. But like I wouldn't be able to tell you what I have 4 days out, 5 days out. I mean, it's all about the calendar. I tie in my to-do list with my calendar. And so like things, even as granular as like, I try to stretch and do meditation for 15 minutes a day every single day. I try to read for at least an hour every single day. And like, even those tasks are in my calendar and they ping me. And so like, I've just kind of modeled what works for me is keeping myself very scheduled and very on task. And within that, there's actual intentional time that is scheduled as free time or just time that I can for myself. So it's not as though I'm booked, minute to minute with things that are occupying my time, because I think it's very important to debrief and be able to have that introspection. But that's something that works for me, and so that's something that that I keep. I have a to-do list. I have a number of to-do lists that are consistently being turned over, and I'm definitely the type of person, like one of my things is there are times where if I've already done something, but I knew it needed to go on the to-do list, just something that like gets me ticking is I'll write it down and then draw a line through it, or I'll check it off mentally, because that's just, I enjoy kind of the game of checking a mental task off or checking a task off. And so I think that's kind of one of the things I want to talk about is find what works for you, find the motivation that works for you. For me, it's like I said, it's like checking off the tasks one by one. And so for me, every single day when I wake up and it says stretch for 15 minutes in my schedule from 7, generally from 7 to 7:15 in the morning, at 7:15 when I get to like click the box that says I've done this, I love that. And so like that's the feeling that I like seek. And so those are my little rewards on a daily basis. And so, but that's it. That's different for everybody. But that's that was a long-winded answer. But that's how I keep track of my stuff. I've got I use Evernote. I use Monday.com for the project board, that like the one that you and I share. I use Google Calendar, and then sometimes, if I'm on the go and Evernote isn't working, or Evernote isn't loaded, I'll just use the native Notes app on Apple on the iPhone. But those are the 4 things that I'm constantly plugged into and keeping kind of up to date.
So yeah, you're right. One of the things about being, everyone's got to figure out what works for them. I can tell you the most effective I am is when I have a notebook, a pen, and I write down all of my tasks for the day. Not meetings, because I keep meetings in a calendar, but tasks. I got to do these things. One of the things I learned was if I write down my task, and I've gotten a bad habit of doing this, is part of the reason I'm curious how you do it is, if I write down my task and I've got, let's just say 15 tasks to do, and they're not always got to be done today. There's just things that I have to do. I can look at those tasks and in the moment evaluate which one either is the hottest priority, it has to be done now, or it might be really easy. Let me go ahead and do that. And I do enjoy that, writing a list down that has no order other than this is just how I thought of these items. Okay, I got to do this, 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 and composing this running tally of these lists. And then when I get through with one, I scratch it off and I re-examine the list and here's what's next. And the reason I like that is because I don't like putting things in order in that regard. Because if I start a task at say 10 o'clock in the morning and I'm not done at 11:30, by 11:30, my whole priority of what I thought was the second thing could have changed, And in that hour and a half, I might have had to add 3 more things to my list. And so therefore, so I like an unorganized list. And I haven't been doing this lately. So that's why I need to, I started using the notes app. I do like just the native notes app because that's very simple. Here's what I got to do. To me, that feels more, I don't like to use the word organic, but it is a little bit more organic. It allows me to just to kind of churn through the things, but I've gotten away from that. I need to get back to something. That's why I was curious how you tackled it. I don't like there's a quote, discipline equals freedom. I don't know who said that, and I think there's some truth in that. I don't like the discipline that you have, although I admire it. And like you said, you got to figure out what works for you. But that's where I've had the most success, when I've been the most effective, is just getting up and writing down all of my tasks in no particular order.
So two things that came to mind when you were talking. Number one, the thing that I do the most, or that I think works the most effectively for me, and this is probably pretty generic, but I group tasks in terms of what the task is. So if I've got 8 people that I need to email to, whether it's me sending an email or responding to an email, I'll try to do those back to back to back. If there's, if I'm looking at a map and I've got 3 different prospects that I need to review, I'll try to do that in one chunk. That's just what works for me. No, I think that's a great point, Ryan. I think one of the things that I keep in mind, that one of the things that I'm always conscious of, is I want to keep my brain and my mind free to think about deals or think about the tasks at hand that are the most important. There's a lot of things, like you were talking about, there's a lot of deals that I have on my plate, and there's a lot of things that I just need to be thinking about. And so I can't afford to have my brain cluttered with, okay, I have to be here at 1:00 and I've got to talk to this person and I've got to do this and that. So I make sure that all of the noise up here is down somewhere so that I can look at something written down. And so I think that's what works for me. If we were able to walk around my office here, on I think 4 or 5 different walls in my office in different places, I have these just transparency boards that are put up on doors and walls that I just have running tally lists of things that I need to do and stuff that I need to be accomplishing and people that I need to be talking to and just deals and whatever works for me, that when I look at it, I can get clued in and be like, okay, that's where we picked up. And so, to your point, a constant battle for me, and what I'm always doing on a daily basis is, okay, so I talked to this person about this deal and we moved the needle to here. And so here's the new update. And because, like you said, I can't afford to talk to somebody and spend, okay, so remind me where we were. Remind me what we talked about last week. That's wasting my time. That's wasting their time. And then at that point, I'm no longer adding enough value. I'm not adding the value that I should be. And so I think it's about keeping for me, like I said, what works for me is keeping the brain able to move moving forward and thinking about the important deal and the important pieces rather than the minutia of tasks and things that need to get done.
And the hard part for me is, and I was saying a minute ago, is that I'm most successful when I'm writing it down. But the problem is that I get a little arrogant. I think I don't have to write it down. I've kind of got it all there, and I kind of get out of that. The next thing you know, Nate's emailing me, "Hey, you're supposed to respond to this." Will's emailing me, "What about this? So and so's about this." And it's easy to slip out of that. But what you find is that again, kind of this idea of multitasking, you really can't do it that well, I don't think. I mean, I think multitasking, if I was going to define it, is you got a lot of tasks that you're working through. You can't do them all at one time, which means that when you're focused on, as you were saying, this particular item over here, you just can't be spending a lot of brain power on something else. And it's hard for me to, I don't know if humble is the right word, or be responsible enough, or whatever it is, be consistent in jotting down what I have to do, because sometimes you feel like you can conquer the world, but you got to stay disciplined.
Absolutely. No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think to a certain extent, it's giving yourself the ability and the permission to write things down as opposed to having to be a mental lockbox. And so, I mean, I allow myself to, if you were to ask me right now, what's your schedule like on Wednesday? I couldn't tell you, but I could tell you, and so it's not important enough for me to know what I've got to do on Wednesday because I've got it right here. It doesn't matter, what my 78 item long to-do list is, because I can tell you, if you had a question about one of the things, I can tell you it's more important. Okay, so you and I are working on project X. What did I talk to the guy about yesterday? and what's the critical update for you. When you and I have time to talk about things next. And that's the other thing. It's about being able to have the information accessible, because if you and I are working on 2 different deals together, 3 different deals together, we also have a number of other things going on. And so you and I may not be able to talk every single day, but when you and I do have the time, it needs to be valuable, and it needs to be accessible. And so when we do talk, I need to be able to download, offload. Okay, these are the updates for you. And I think that's one of the reasons. I mean, you and I have enough products going on that we've got this this Monday board, but I don't have that relationship with a lot of the guys that I do deals with. And so when they call me, I need to be able to pick up the phone and say, okay, so here's where we are. Here's where we need to go.
Yeah, okay, so I'm glad you brought that up, because that's the counter to why there's some of the things I mentioned about not writing it down, but the other thing is about not writing stuff down or not putting on task thing is I do let those things slip through the cracks. However, my retention for the other things is very high, because once I write it down, I don't think about it. And so if I don't write stuff down, I can usually retain what it is, because there's kind of this force of, hey, I've got to remember what's going on. So how do you balance that? Because that's a struggle for me. If I write something down, it's on the list and I don't think about it.
Really what I think you're talking about is, I think you're talking about retraining your brain, retraining your mental process to cue into the mental list versus the written list. And so again, it's about delegation. It's about, what you're talking about. What I think we're kind of dancing around is how do you mentally delegate things? What's worth the bandwidth up here versus what can be put into a device. We have access to so many different technologies and so many different devices these days that why am I going to keep in mind the mundane checklist and the to-do list? Why does that need to be up here when it can be here? And so what I think you're talking about is, and it takes work, but I mean, so now when I'm thinking about like a to-do list or a project to-do list, I have a hard time coming up with a organic to-do list in my brain. But if I'm looking at one of my notes, I may only have 3 words written down, but that'll jog my brain about, two dozen different things. And so I think it's about retraining your brain on what the mental cues are and what triggers the thought process more than anything.
No, and that's a good point you brought up there, is that once you kind of get into this, the habit of the list making, it doesn't have to be super formal, because it's weird. Your brain, there's a, I don't know why, it's one of those memories that I've never forgotten, I don't know why, but we went to this meeting one time and I had a list of like 4 action items, and one of them was change Patrick. And change Patrick. And so I handed it to the guy with me. I said, do you know what that means? And I did. He did. And he goes, I don't know. Is Patrick a baby, or, he need new clothes? What's going on here? But to me, I knew everything that there was about that. And of course, if it had been 3 months later and I would have looked at it, it'd probably been a lot harder. But in that moment, I knew what it was. And so there is something to, the list making, if you can kind of teeter on that line of not spending 3 hours filling out your task report versus keeping it short enough where you can look at it 3 days later and remember what that means.
Absolutely. I mean, what we're talking about here, Ryan, is you need to find, I mean, this is a trial and error. There are going to be some people that are listening to this that will, be tied into their calendar on their phone. There are some people, like you see right here on my wall, there are some people that are going to tell you that unless it's written down on a calendar, like in pen, that they can't follow it. There are going to be some people that carry around, I know people that still carry around notepads that write down notes. And so when I'm in meetings, my process is, when I'm sitting down with somebody in a meeting face to face, I always have a yellow pad with me, and I'm jotting down the important notes so that when I go back afterwards, I can, in my own brain, make my to-do list and make my checklist that works for me. And so it's about what works for you at each step in the process. And so, there are going to be some people that, okay, so like trying writing down something on the wall calendar, and then like realizing after a week and a half, like, I've been trying to do this, but I haven't even looked at it once. Okay, so like the next thing you try is, okay, like try the Google Calendar, and okay, that's not working. And so what I would advise to somebody, and this is getting really granular, but I would advise, even as something as if you're carrying around an iPhone and you're trying to get in the habit of writing down notes more often, or using the calendar more often, go into your calendar and set a reminder for every, let's call it 2 hours, and just have the reminder say, check your calendar or write a note. Just mundane details, because then after seeing that notification, 5 times a day for a week, you're either going to train your brain and figure out, okay, let me start doing this, or you're going to move on to option C. And so it's about figuring out, like in this specific niche, it's just about trial and error. It's about finding out what works for you, because some people, everybody's going to work differently, right? And there's no right way.
Yeah. I think just to kind of see if we can summarize like this, for me, the balance when you're talking about whether it's multitasking, delegation, any of these things is that you have to kind of figure out where it is that, for me, I have some, we can call it insecurity or whatever, being called a list stuff. I've done it. I'm not saying I haven't, and there's plenty of things that I don't put in the memory bank that people call me up and I do put things out of mind for sure. It seems like you got to kind of figure out, okay, where do you want to be? What tasks are important? What tasks are easy? What are hard? How to break those down? How much level of detail you're getting into? All those things, I think, really depend on the person. And at the end of the day, it's kind of, you got to, like you said, there's a trial and I can't even think now, trial and fail almost aspect to this. And as you work through it, you kind of figure out where you are. But I think the comfort is kind of the key. It's not that Evernote's the best or this or Monday's the best. For me, it comes down to comfort with, when you call me, what is it that I feel like I should know about when you call me? And I need to gear myself around how much I can take on, how many tasks I can do, how many things I can work on. All of this stuff to me boils down to, when the phone rings or when you text me, can I answer that question? And if I can, and it's an important question, then my system is generally working. If I can't, then either I've got too many lists, or I've got not enough lists, or whatever the case is, or I'm involved too much, or not enough. That's kind of how I would summarize that.
Yeah, I think that you and I think we see a lot of the similarities, but I think to a degree, I think we're basically saying the same thing. But I think it's, it's interesting. I've got a lot to say about that, but really, what I think it comes down to is being able to be authentic and being able to be valuable to the people in your network. And so, this is not necessarily specifically addressing what you just said, but I mean, I think it paints a good picture. When I message somebody out of the blue, because I'll message people, completely sight unseen, if they're, in an industry that's related to me or something like that. And, I generally, I don't know about you, and we could talk about this on this podcast or another, but when I message someone on LinkedIn for the first time, when I make a connection request, a lot of times I will not send a long-winded message with that request. I'm more looking to make the connection, because to me, it's almost like a litmus test of someone. Okay, if they're accepting my request with a little bit of information, that means that they may be, willing to kind of play ball, maybe a little bit more kind of entrepreneurial minded, etc. And so then I'll follow up with something as simple as, hey, I appreciate you following up or accepting my connection request. Zahav Resources does X, Y, and Z in the midstream and mineral space. Here's the kind of different deals that we're looking at. Here's what we do in the market. Here are the relationships that we're trying to foster. And here are the people and here are the companies that we like to work with. If you think there would be some synergy with that, with this description, shoot me a message back and let's get on a call and just kind of see where we can take things. And so I think on the front end, I like to set the expectation of, I want this to be a flexible relationship. I want this to be a win-win, but at the same time, I'm walking in the door with, how can I provide value to you? Obviously in return, I'm going to get value for that. But I think, looking at it through that prism of, what can I do to step in the door and be of value to you? So to your point, to me, it's not necessarily about, being a lockbox of information up here, but it's more macro than that. Again, we could talk about this at length, but that's kind of, to wrap it up, that's kind of what I'm looking at.
Okay. Well, and I think we said offline, we'll say online, is that it doesn't have to be that we're not on this show to agree about everything or to have 100% of alignment. It's more to talk about the opportunities we see, how we do things, and just kind of flesh some of that out. And sometimes there will be perfect unity, and sometimes there won't be.
I'm just looking forward to, at some point, one of these, we're going to flip roles, and I'm going to be the one in the host seat, if you will, and I'm going to be grilling you. It's going to be, I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be good.
Yeah, well, maybe if we get one released, then we can flip roles.
Ouch. That's how it is.
To the listeners, be sure to connect with Ben and myself on LinkedIn. We'll link our profiles in the show notes. We will talk to you next week.